Hello and welcome to our first attempt at the flipped classroom. Just some points of reference. Every time that you watch a video, I am expecting that you will be taking notes on that video because we will be using the information in class the next time we meet. I will not be pausing so that you can take the time to write your notes down. So you will need to utilize your pause button. You have a couple of options. You can either write as we go and just pause as necessary, or in an instance like this where we're using a PowerPoint, you can wait until I'm finished with that current slide and then pause, go back and write down everything that you need for that slide. Today we're going to be focusing on the grammar section of the SAT, or a portion of the writing section, and my information is coming from our Princeton Reviews Cracking the SAT 2015 edition. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. The first thing we're going to look at are some of the basic strategies. Something to remember in the writing section: there is no order of difficulty. You want to use your personal order of difficulty, or as we like to call it, your POOD. So if there's a question that you're particularly stuck on, go ahead and mark that in your test booklet so that you can come back to it if you have time at the end, but don't get too bogged down on one particular question. Do not base your answer on what sounds right. We speak and use informal English in everyday situations, and that is the type of English that you are most familiar with and most comfortable with. So oftentimes what sounds right is not necessarily grammatically correct. Let's look at an example. In a conversation between two friends, a phone conversation, one of them might answer, "Hello, who's there?" And their friend says, "It's me." The first friend says, "Oh, hey, where are you?" And the other friend replies, "Me and my friends are headed to the movie theater. You coming?" The first friend says, "Cool, I'll be there." That sounds like a typical conversation that you would have with somebody, and it sounds correct. However, grammatically, it is not correct. So let's look at that conversation again, or listen to that conversation again, edited so that it is now grammatically correct. "Hello, who's there?" "It is I." "Oh, hey, at what location are you?" "My friends and I are going to the movie theater. Would you like to join us?" "Indeed, I shall be there." So as you can see, it's a lot different than how we normally speak. So if you're just basing your answer on what sounds right, you're going to be missing out on a possibility of finding the correct answer. Unless you're a complete grammar guru and you know absolutely everything about grammar and you speak in proper formal English every single time, do not base your answer just on what sounds right. Along those same lines, just because it's a word or a phrase that you wouldn't use, don't assume that it's wrong. Again, going back to the point we made before, we speak in informal English for the majority of our conversations. So there are more formal ways of saying things that we don't necessarily use. Some would use more than others, but just because you personally wouldn't use that phrase or that word or that choice of vocabulary, don't automatically assume that it's wrong. The fourth strategy is to plan on doing this grammar portion of the SAT twice. The first time through, you're going and just hitting the easy questions. Something to note, most of the improving paragraph questions are on an easy to medium level difficulty. So you should try to answer as many of those as you can on your first go-around. Remember that as you're going through and working on just the easy questions, you're marking in your test book the questions that you're skipping so that they're easy to find when you go back for the second time. So with the time that you have left, if you have time left, you'll go back through and work on the harder questions. Only answer a question if you can eliminate one or more answer choices. Now, that strategy only is true for our seniors who are going to be taking the SAT in December. If you are a junior and you're planning on taking the SAT after or on the March or later date, you can feel free to answer any and all questions that you wish, because your penalty for incorrect guessing will be removed. But still, don't focus undue attention on questions that are going to waste your time. Wait and work on those at the very end. If you are waiting until we're finished with a slide to copy down the notes, now would be a good time to pause the video. So the grammar section on the SAT, or the writing section, has 3 different question types, and we're really going to focus today on just the first one, the error ID. We're also going to touch a little bit on improving sentences, and at another lesson we'll look at improving paragraphs. Error ID and improving sentences follow along with some of the same strategies, and the improving paragraphs is kind of a horse of a different color, so we'll come back to that at another time. So some tips for the error ID questions. Do these first and plan on answering all of them. For the error ID questions, you're not asked to correct them. You're simply being asked to identify where the error is. So these should go fairly quickly for you, not take up a lot of time, and because they're a little bit easier, that will give you more time to focus on the sentence, correcting the sentence section. There is never more than one error within a sentence. Any possible errors would be underlined, except in this case, if you notice I have a typo that I'm just realizing. But on the SAT, any possible errors would be underlined. So for example, if you're looking at a sentence and you find a part of the sentence that you think is incorrect, that is not underlined, assume that that is the correct part, which means usually that something else in the sentence is wrong, which is a little hint for you that it is not correct as it is. The 4th tip is that approximately 20% of the error ID questions are correct as they are, and that equates up into about 1 in 5 questions. So don't be afraid every now and again to mark it correct as is. Here's an example of an error ID question. Josie told the school counselor his plan. He will attend college, major in criminal justice, and to become a lawyer. Notice that there are 4 possibilities within the sentence that could be incorrect. Your 5th option that will always appear is option E, no error. So if you read through the sentence after we've gone through all of our grammar rules and have not found any errors, your default will be no error, answer choice E. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about our tips for improving sentences. When you have an improving sentence question, choice A is always a copy or a repeat of the underlined section. So kind of the reverse of our error ID, where if it's all correct, you mark E. For this particular portion, if it's correct as is, you'll choose choice A. If you're unsure, look at the answer choices for clues, and we're going to have more on that at another time. Just like with the error ID questions, approximately 20% of the improving sentences portion of the grammar section are correct as is. And again, that's choice A that you're choosing to improve sentences. And the 4th tip is KISS. Keep it short and sweet. The most concise or the shortest way to make your point is usually the most correct when it comes to the SATs. Here's an example of an improving sentence question. Although both Senator Fritz and Senator Pierce have proposed plans to reduce the deficit, only one of the 2 are viable. So if you see, the very end of the sentence is underlined. Looking at our answer choices, answer choice A is exactly the same as the underlined portion of the section. Answer choices B, C, D, and E offer different ways or different possibilities to correct this sentence. We have some basic SAT grammar rules that we're going to look at. Sentence structure, verbs, nouns, pronouns, prepositions, and some miscellaneous things like misplaced modifiers. Today we're going to focus mainly on sentence structure, and the next time we have class we will be doing work together and practicing putting to use our sentence structure rules. So one of the main things with sentence structure that the SAT purposely gets wrong or purposely creates errors in is a clause. So we have two different types of clauses. The first kind is an independent clause, also known as the main clause. It stands on its own as a sentence. So an independent clause is just a fancy way of saying a sentence, and it's a simple sentence. An example of that, actually two examples. Susie wanted to go shopping, she wanted to go to the sale. The second type of clause is a subordinate clause, also known as a dependent clause. Dependent meaning that it can't stand alone, it needs an independent clause. Also note, a subordinate clause cannot be attached to just another subordinate clause. It needs an independent clause somewhere on its own. So an example of subordinate clause, since Sam is very dirty. So how do we combine clauses in the proper way? We can combine independent clauses either with a semicolon or a comma followed by a conjunction. Using a semicolon isn't very common, but these are the SATs. So they're probably going to use a method that is uncommon, so I want you to be familiar with this. So the first revision, if you remember our independent clauses from the last slide, Susie wanted to go shopping, she wanted to go to the sale. If you look at the first revision, we've taken out the period at the end of the first independent clause, changed it to a semicolon, and instead of having a second sentence, we've just attached it to the end. So you can see here, she is no longer capitalized. The second revision, we simply use a comma and then we insert a conjunction. Susie wanted to go shopping and she wanted to go to the sale. Of course, we have some things that you should never do when you are combining independent clauses. If you're going to use a comma, you must use a conjunction. You cannot use a comma just by itself. They also need to be combined using some sort of punctuation. You can't just completely leave the punctuation out, as in this case. So this would be what we would consider a run-on sentence. Susie wanted to go shopping, she wanted to go to the sale. There's no punctuation there to indicate that you need to take a pause between shopping and she. What about subordinate clauses or dependent clauses? Well, there's two different situations where you see a subordinate clause. Most of the time it's at the beginning or the end of a sentence. In that case, you simply separate it with a comma or a conjunction. Since Sam is very dirty, comma, he needs a bath. Notice the difference here. In our independent clauses, you could not use just a comma. You needed a comma and a conjunction. However, when you have a dependent clause joined with an independent clause, you use just a comma. For two more examples, if you actually look at our bullet points, when the subordinate clause is at the beginning or end, separate with a comma or conjunction. We are starting this tip with a dependent clause when subordinate clause is at the beginning or end. That can't stand on its own. It needs to be joined with the independent clause. Separate with a comma or conjunction. Our next tip is the exact same. When the subordinate clause is in the middle, which is another situation, that is a dependent clause. It can't stand on its own. No punctuation is necessary, independent clause, and it supports this with a comma. So for the second tip, when the subordinate clause is in the middle, you don't need punctuation. And these ones are a little trickier to see. So if you look at this example, the shirt that he put on was too small. That sounds pretty normal, but if you actually look closely, we have a subordinate clause hidden in the middle of this sentence. So if you take out the middle words and just look at the beginning and the end, the shirt was too small. That is your independent clause. Looking in the middle, that he put on is your subordinate clause. So in this situation, you don't need any punctuation. So that is the end of our tips for joining independent clauses and subordinate and independent clauses. If you have any questions, jot them down in your notes if there's something that is still confusing to you. Also jot that down in your notes, and when we are joined together for class again, you will be able to remember your questions, and I will hopefully be able to answer them. Thank you very much for watching, and see you all soon.